On the night of October 15, 1946, in a cell in the security wing of Nuremberg prison, a man who had commanded the second most powerful military force in the world lay on his cot with his hands visibly outstretched on the blanket. It was his custom. The guards watched him through the small oval window of the metal door every 30 seconds, as they had done since the beginning of the trial, 11 months earlier. In the adjoining cells, other men awaited the same fate. One prayed in a low voice, another paced endlessly from wall to wall, another wrote a letter that no one he cared about would ever read. They had been waiting for that moment since October 1st. The International Military Tribunal had met 216 times. He had heard testimonies describing crematorium ovens, cattle trains loaded with human beings, mass graves in the Russian snow, labor camps where prisoners weighed 40 kilos when they died. The documentary evidence presented by the prosecution filled tens of thousands of pages, and the verdict, read before the whole world, had separated the men in the dock into 3 categories: those who would be hanged, those who would spend the rest of their lives behind bars, and the 3 who would walk out the front door. But that night, all that was behind him. What remained was a building with stone walls, a hemp rope, and the thud of a trapdoor opening in the darkness. Nuremberg had symbolic meaning before it had a legal meaning. It was in that Bavarian city that the National Socialist Party held its large annual rallies from 1933 to 1938. The architect Albert Speer designed the Zeppelinfeld there, a limestone esplanade capable of holding 340,000 people, illuminated by 130 anti-aircraft searchlights that formed walls of white light up to 10 kilometers high. It was in Nuremberg that on September 15, 1935, the Nuremberg laws were enacted, stripping Jewish citizens of Germany of their nationality and prohibiting mixed marriages. It was in that city that Adolf Hitler delivered the speeches that mobilized millions. When the Allies won the war and needed a place to judge those who had started it, they chose Nuremberg for both practical and narrative reasons. The Palace of Justice, located at 1 Bürgerstrasse, had survived relatively intact the Allied bombings that had destroyed 90% of the historic center. It had large courtrooms and, above all, the annexed prison could house the accused throughout the process. The ruined city, with its medieval facades bursting and its streets littered with rubble, did the rest. The same men who had paraded triumphantly under those towers would now be judged among their ashes. The trial began on November 20th, 1945. 24 senior officials of the Nazi regime were charged on 4 counts: conspiracy to commit crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Robert Ley, head of the German Labour Front, had hanged himself in his cell on October 25, 1945, before the trial began, using strips of a towel tied to the toilet cistern. His suicide caused Colonel Burton C. Andrus, the prison's commander, to quadruple the number of guards, a permanent sentinel in front of each cell, 24 hours a day. Gustav Krupp von Bohlen und Halbach, the great industrialist who had armed Germany, was declared incapable of trial for severe mental deterioration. The remaining 22 took their seats in the dock. On the walls of room 600 of the Palace of Justice, the 4 victorious countries, the United States, Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, had installed simultaneous translation systems in 4 languages. It was the first time in history that this system was used in an international court. The defendants wore black headphones. They could hear in German every accusation, every testimony, every paragraph of the sentence that would later decide whether they would live or die. Defense attorneys filed more than 100,000 affidavits. The prosecution brought into evidence more than 3,000 documents, most of them captured directly from the Reich archives. That was what set Nuremberg apart from any previous process. The Nazis documented everything. His own words, with his own signatures on his own papers, were the most devastating accusation possible. The chief U.S. attorney, Robert H. Jackson, stated in his opening address that the crimes the court was to examine were so calculated, so monstrous, and so devastating that civilization could not ignore them if it wanted to survive. He was right about one thing. The war that these men planned and carried out had killed between 70 and 85 million human beings, about 3% of the world's population in 1940. The defendants listened into their headphones. Before talking about how they died, we must understand how they lived those 11 months of trial. The cells of the Nuremberg prison measured approximately 3 meters by 4. They had a bed, a table, a chair, and a toilet in the corner. The window was too small to look out. The light came in filtered. The guards watched through the oval window of the door every 30 seconds, without exception, day and night. After Lay's suicide, metal spoons and forks were replaced with wooden cutlery. The belts were confiscated, shoelaces too. Colonel Andrus described his responsibility with a military conciseness that left no room for interpretation, to keep the prisoners alive long enough for the court to try them. Psychologist Gustav M. Gilbert, the son of Austrian Jewish immigrants born in New York in 1911, and with a doctorate in experimental psychology from Columbia University, arrived in Nuremberg on October 20th, 1945, just a month before the trial began. His German was fluent. His method was simple: talk. He never took notes in front of the prisoners. As soon as he got out of a cell, he wrote everything down from memory. Those notes became the Nuremberg Diary, published in 1947. Gilbert and psychiatrist Douglas Kelly administered IQ tests to the 21 defendants using a German version of the Wechsler-Bellevue test. The average was 128, ranging from superior to very superior. The individual results revealed something that no one fully expected. The intellectual average of the architects of the genocide was remarkably high. Hjalmar Schacht topped the list with 143 points. Seyss-Inquart followed with 141. Göring scored 138 and was pleased with the result, until he discovered that Schacht and Seyss-Inquart had surpassed him. Dönitz equaled Göring with 138. Von Papen obtained 134. At the lower end, Julius Streicher recorded 106, the lowest score in the group. Kaltenbrunner got 113. The examiners noted that the results said nothing about moral ability, empathy, or a tendency to cruelty. The intelligence measured by these tests was no safeguard against participation in systematic violence. Göring dominated the bench from day one, just as he had dominated the corridors of power for 12 years. He settled into the front row seat. He was visibly irritated by the indifference of Hess, who was next to him. Gilbert recorded in his diary that Göring was actively looking for ways to keep the group cohesive so that the others would not cooperate with the accusation, so that the process would become a scene of political resistance. He was, Gilbert noted, the natural leader of that last improvised cabinet, but the group was not homogeneous. There were factions visible even from the press gallery. Albert Speer headed the wing that was willing to condemn the regime, to separate itself from Hitler, to present itself as technocrats who had not known what was happening. Speer never fully forgave Göring for his contempt for his position. The confrontation between the two was constant during the trial. Frank distanced himself from the others from the moment he took his seat, carried away by the religious guilt that, according to him, consumed him. Schacht made no secret of his contempt for almost everyone, including Göring, whose economic management he had fiercely criticized before the war. And then there was Streicher, who was openly repudiated by his own co-defendants. Göring told Gilbert that Streicher was a moron who had hurt the party more than he had helped it. Several defendants expressly asked not to have to share the bus that transported them between the prison and the courtroom with Streicher. On October 1st, 1946, at 2:50 p.m., the president of the court, Lord Geoffrey Lawrence, a 63-year-old British judge who had presided over the trial with a firmness that observers in all countries would later praise, began reading the individual verdicts. The defendants were taken to the courtroom one by one. The elevator that took them from the prison basement to the courtroom level opened at the back of the dock. Each man entered through that wood-paneled door, put on the headphones that a guard in a white helmet held out to him, waited to hear his name and the sentence, and went back down the same elevator. Hermann Goering was the first. When Lord Lawrence read "Death by Hanging," Goering turned on his heel and re-entered the elevator without a word. The wooden door closed. There was a murmur of whispered voices in the room. Rudolf Hess was the second. Life imprisonment. Hess blinked, nodded slightly, and disappeared. Joachim von Ribbentrop listened to the death sentence with his jaw clenched. Keitel, also dead, did not acknowledge visible receipt. And so, one after another, the men on the bench knew their fate. On 9th and 10th October 1946, the Allied Control Council met in Berlin to consider appeals filed by those sentenced to death. Practically all of them asked for clemency, except Kaltenbrunner. Goering, Keitel and Jodl also asked, if they were denied clemency, to be shot instead of hanged, as befitted the military. The Council unanimously rejected all requests, including the request for a change in the method of implementation. From that moment on, the date was set, the night of October 15th to 16th, 1946. In the days following October 10th, the prison chaplains, Lutheran pastor Henry Gareca for Protestants, Catholic priest Sixtus O'Connor for Catholics, multiplied their visits. Ribbentrop spent a long time with Gareca in religious conversation. Hans Frank, the convert, confessed repeatedly to Father O'Connor. Keitel asked to be read fragments of the Bible. Kaltenbrunner refused the sacraments. Goering, in his last session with Gilbert, showed no regrets. When asked by Gilbert if he had anything to say about the regime's crimes, Goering replied, according to the psychologist's record, "The victor is always the judge, and the vanquished is always the accused." It was his last philosophy, 4 pages of argumentation compressed into one sentence. Reichsmarschall Hermann Wilhelm Goering entered the trial 57 kilos lighter than he weighed in 1940. He had arrived in Nuremberg in May 1945, specifically from the Mondorf-les-Bains prisoner of war camp in Luxembourg, known as Camp Ashcan, weighing 124 kilos and severely addicted to dihydrocodeine, a synthetic opioid that he consumed in doses that reached 40 pills a day. Colonel Andrus, who had managed the Mondorf camp before the transfer to Nuremberg, described his first meeting with Goering with a phrase that became famous. When Goering arrived in Mondorf, he was a slimy simpleton with 2 suitcases full of paracodeine. I thought he was a drug salesman, but we detox him and turn him into a man. Detoxification was gradual, under the medical supervision of Doctors Miller and Kelly with decreasing doses of paracodeine. By the time he sat in the dock, Goering weighed about 80 kilograms, had a clear mind for the first time in years, and had decided to make the trial his personal stage. Goering was not a passive defendant. Psychologist Gilbert, who visited him in his cell regularly throughout the trial, described Goering as the dominant intellectual in the dock. He was charismatic, intelligent, ruthless in his analysis, and totally convinced that history would vindicate him. When U.S. Chief Prosecutor Robert H. Jackson began his cross-examination, Goering took control of the courtroom with a skill that left the prosecutor visibly out of place for the first few days. Jackson had to change tactics. The press covered the match extensively. The tribunal found that Goering had been after Hitler, the most powerful man in the regime. He had founded the Gestapo in Prussia on April 26, 1933. He had created the first concentration camps. He had presided over the conference of November 12, 1938, in which it was decided to impose a fine of 1 billion marks on the entire German Jewish community after Kristallnacht, so that the insurance funds for the destroyed properties would flow to the state instead of to the owners. On July 31, 1941, he had signed the document that commissioned Heinrich Himmler and Reinhard Heydrich to plan what the minutes called a total solution to the Jewish problem in the German sphere of influence in Europe. The court concluded that his guilt was unique in its enormity. His IQ of 138 made him the third highest in the group. He was furious that he had found out. The verdict came on October 1, 1946. Guilty on all 4 counts. The sentence, death by hanging. Göring asked to be shot. That request was denied. The Allied Control Council's appeals were denied on October 10th. The night of October 15th was the last of his life. At 9:30 p.m., journalists were authorized to inspect the cell block. Guards reported that Göring appeared to be sleeping with his hands visibly on the blanket. It was his usual position. No one would be alarmed by that. At 10:45 p.m., the guard noticed something different on Göring's face. He called the corporal on duty. When the doctor arrived, the sound of agony was already in his throat. A vial of potassium cyanide. They found it inside a brass capsule the size of a rifle cartridge. 3 handwritten notes accompanied the empty cartridge. One addressed to Colonel Andrus, another to his wife Emmy, a third with no clear recipient. The content of the notes was not immediately published. How he had gotten the poison after more than a year under extreme surveillance remained unsolved for decades. The most documented hypothesis points to an American guard named Herbert Lee Stivers, 19 years old at the time, who testified in 2005, when he was 78, that a German woman had convinced him to pass on to Göring what she described as medication in a fountain pen. Stivers said he did not know what the object contained. The statement was not judicially verified, but coincides with some documented circumstantial details. Other theories suggest that the poison could have been hidden inside a bottle of toothpaste that Göring had kept since his arrival, or that a German doctor from the prison staff was an accomplice. The technical mystery was never definitively solved. Göring's body was transferred to the prison gymnasium. He was placed in the execution chamber to be photographed next to the bodies of the 10 who did die on the gallows, symbolically occupying the place he should have occupied under the noose. At 1:11 a.m. on October 16, 1946, Joachim von Ribbentrop walked through the door of the Nuremberg prison gymnasium and became the first man of the night to walk to the gallows. He was the former Reich foreign minister. He was born on April 30, 1893 in Wesel, in the Rhineland region of Prussia. He studied in France and Canada before World War I, where he served as an officer in the German army. He entered the world of diplomacy not through his traditional career but through his social connections. In 1920 he married Anna Elisabeth Henkel, heiress of an important German wine company, whose fortune and contacts opened doors for him. He negotiated the Anglo-German Naval Agreement of 1935 as his first major diplomatic achievement, and the Anti-Comintern Pact of 1936. His appointment as ambassador to London from August 1936 was a resounding failure. Count Galeazzo Ciano, Mussolini's son-in-law, wrote in his diary that Ribbentrop was one of the stupidest men in Europe. Even within the Nazi circle, his arrogance and lack of diplomatic tact were legendary. His IQ on Gilbert's tests was 129 at the upper end of the upper rank. The tribunal documented that Ribbentrop had been directly involved in the persecution of Jews on an international scale. In September 1942, he ordered German diplomatic representatives in the Axis satellite countries to speed up deportations of Jews to the east. In June 1942, the German ambassador in Vichy asked Pierre Laval to hand over 50,000 Jews for deportation. In February 1943, Ribbentrop protested to Mussolini about the Italian slowness in deporting Jews from the Italian occupation zone in France. On April 17, 1943, he participated in the conference between Hitler and Admiral Miklos Horthy of Hungary, where both he and Hitler lobbied to speed up the deportation of Hungarian Jews. Ribbentrop informed Horthy that the Jews should be exterminated or taken to concentration camps. The court found him guilty on all 4 counts. His intelligence score turned out to be paradoxically higher than that of several of his colleagues. But intelligence and political skill are different things. The night before, reporters had seen him in his cell talking quietly to the prison chaplain, Lutheran pastor Henry Gericke. It was a conversation that had been going on for days. When he entered the gym with an emaciated face and sunken cheekbones, 2 U.S. Army sergeants immediately flanked him. Another sergeant replaced the metal handcuffs with a leather strap that tied his wrists behind his back. The original plan was for the condemned to walk from the cells with their hands free, but Göring's suicide hours earlier had changed the protocol on the spot. The room had 3 scaffolds arranged in a row. 2 would be used alternately to pick up the pace, the third as a backup. Each scaffold consisted of a raised wooden platform with 13 steps, a horizontal beam, and a 2-leaf trapdoor that opened by pushing a lever. When the officer on duty asked him his name at the foot of the steps, Ribbentrop was slow to answer. They repeated it to him, and then he almost shouted, "Joachim von Ribbentrop!" He climbed the 13 steps without hesitation. On the platform, the executioner, Master Sergeant John C. Woods, held the 13-turn rope. He was asked if he had any final statements to make. "God protect Germany. May God have mercy on my soul. My last wish is that German unity will be maintained, that understanding between East and West will be achieved, and that there will be peace for the world." The trapdoor opened at 1:16. Ribbentrop was pronounced dead at 1:29, 13 minutes after falling. The doctors present certified that there was no neck fracture in the fall. Master Sergeant Woods had used standard drop lengths that did not adequately compensate for each individual's weight. Some of those condemned that night did not die from cervical rupture but from slow strangulation. Some sources present cited times of between 14 and 28 minutes for certain prisoners. The US military publicly denied claims of prolonged strangulation but did not produce autopsy records. Wilhelm Keitel was the second to die that night. The clock showed 1:40 when he went up to the gallows. He was born on September 22, 1882 in Helmscherode, a small town in Lower Saxony. He was the eldest son of a rural landowner. He entered the army in 1901 and served in World War I, reaching the rank of major. He rose gradually during the Weimar Republic and became chief of the personal staff of War Minister Werner von Blomberg in 1935. When Hitler assumed direct command of the armed forces on February 4, 1938, dissolving the War Ministry and creating the OKW, Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the High Command of the Wehrmacht, Keitel was appointed its chief. It was the highest position in the German military command after Hitler himself. But the OKW was not a conventional operational staff. It was, in effect, Hitler's military secretariat. Feldmarschall Erwin von Manstein, who dealt with him regularly during the war, later wrote that Keitel was the least fit to hold that office. The German generals called him Lakitel, a pun on his surname, and the German word Lakai, lackey. The accusation was used in the courtroom itself by one of his colleagues. His IQ on Gilbert's tests was 129, identical to Ribbentrop's. Keitel had signed the decree of December 7, 1941, known as Nacht und Nebel, Night and Fog, under which civilians from the occupied territories accused of resistance would be secretly detained, transferred to Germany without notification to their families or the protecting countries, and tried only if a death penalty was likely. Otherwise, they will be handed over to the Gestapo without leaving a trace of their whereabouts. His name appeared on orders authorizing the shooting of 50 to 100 Soviet civilians for every German soldier killed in resistance attacks. On May 13, 1941, he had signed a directive under which civilians suspected of crimes against troops could be shot without trial, and German soldiers who committed crimes against civilians would not be prosecuted. Faced with all that documentation with his signature, Keitel adopted a defense that the court disarmed with 3 sentences. Superior orders, even for a soldier, cannot be considered as a mitigating circumstance when the crimes committed are so shocking and extensive, and were carried out knowingly and ruthlessly, without excuse or military justification. Guilty on all 4 counts. Like Göring and Jodl, Keitel asked to be shot rather than hanged. It was denied. In the final hours, Keitel asked to have Bible passages read to him. According to reporter Kingsbury Smith, who was drawn among the journalists to represent the American press in the execution chamber, Keitel behaved to the end with the rigidity of an officer in training. He climbed the steps of the gallows as if he were ascending to a podium, with his Feldmarshal's uniform perfectly ironed and his boots polished. He had asked to keep the uniform. When asked about his last statement, he spoke in a firm voice. More than 2 million German soldiers went to meet their death for their homeland before me. That number is my death. Germany above all. God protect Germany. They put the hood on him. It fell at 140. When he fell, the narrow trapdoor of the gallows caused head injuries when it hit the side edges. Keitel's post-mortem photographs, published later, clearly show the cuts on his scalp. The design of the trapdoor, too narrow to allow a clean descent, affected several of the condemned that night. He was pronounced dead at 1:44. Ernst Kaltenbrunner was 6 feet tall. His face was scarred by student duels, his jaw protruding, his eyes deeply sunken. He was Austrian, born on October 4, 1903 in Riedim-Innkreis, a town in the state of Upper Austria. He had studied law at the University of Graz, where he was part of the student associations that cultivated pan-Germanic militarism and academic anti-Semitism. He joined the Austrian Nazi Party and the SS in 1932. His IQ, as measured by Gilbert, was 113, second lowest in the group after Streicher. Examiners of the time described Kaltenbrunner as a physically imposing but intellectually mediocre man who had reached his position more by brutality than by political ability. His own co-defendants considered him crude. When Reinhard Heydrich died on June 4, 1942, from wounds sustained in the Prague bombing of May 27th, launched by Czechoslovakian paratroopers trained by the Allies in Britain, the post of chief of the RSHA became vacant for several months. On January 30, 1943, Kaltenbrunner was named successor. Under his direction, the RSHA oversaw the deportation and extermination of approximately 6 million Jews, 2 million murdered by the Einsatzgruppen in the east, 4 million in the death camps. Kaltenbrunner had direct authority over the Gestapo, the SD, and the criminal police. Prosecutor Whitney R. Harris, who had searched for weeks for the Auschwitz commandant without finding him, described the moment when he interrogated Rudolf Höss in Nuremberg for 3 days and reduced his testimony to an affidavit in which Höss confessed to overseeing the murder of 2.5 million people in that camp. That affidavit entered the proceedings thanks to Kaltenbrunner's defense. Kaltenbrunner's lawyer, Dr. Kurt Kaufmann, called Höss as a defense witness, believing that his statement would favor his client, and instead ended up entering the complete confession of the Auschwitz commandant into the record. During the trial, Kaltenbrunner repeatedly refused to sign documents that were clearly signed with his name. The court noted that it was inconceivable that his signature should appear on so many orders of such importance without his authorization. He was the only one of the defendants sentenced to death who did not apply to the Allied Control Council for clemency. He was also the only one who, during the trial, claimed to have tried to resist Himmler's policies from within, a claim that the court explicitly rejected. Prosecutor Harris, present that night at the gym, later described the tone of Kaltenbrunner's last words as apologetic. In a low but audible voice, he uttered, "Germany, good luck." According to the Time magazine reporter present that night, when the black hood was placed over his head, Kaltenbrunner was still talking. The trapdoor opened at 1:39. He was pronounced dead at 1:52. Alfred Rosenberg was the ideologue of the party. He was born on January 12, 1893 in Reval, today Tallinn, capital of Estonia, a city that was then part of the Russian Empire. He studied architecture in Moscow before the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 brought him to Germany. His anti-Semitism predated his accession to the NSDAP. He He arrived in Munich in 1918, already convinced that the Jews were the cause of the German defeat in World War I and the collapse of the Russian Empire. His book, The Myth of the 20th Century, published in 1930, reached a circulation of more than 1 million copies and was considered the second most important ideological work of Nazism after Hitler's Mein Kampf. Rosenberg considered it his magnum opus, an attempt to replace Christianity with a new Aryan racial religion based on Norse blood, soil, and heritage. The book was obscure, pretentious, and difficult to read, but its symbolic influence was enormous. Even Hitler himself admitted privately that he had not read it in its entirety. His IQ was 127, placing him in the superior range, but considerably below Göring or Schacht. In 1940, he organized the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, a unit specializing in the systematic looting of museums, libraries, and private collections in the occupied territories. By July 14, 1944, his organization had confiscated more than 21,903 works of art, paintings, and museum pieces in Western Europe. In the so-called Action M from Mobile Furniture, initiated in December 1941 at his suggestion, 69,619 Jewish homes were looted in the West, 38,000 in Paris alone, and 26,984 railway cars were needed to transport the contents to Germany. As Reich Minister for the occupied Eastern Territories from July 17, 1941, Rosenberg was responsible for the policies of forced Germanization, economic exploitation, slave labor, and extermination of Jews in the areas under his administration. In June 1941, 2 days before the attack on the Soviet Union, he had told his collaborators that the aim was to nourish Germany with the resources of the Eastern Territories, knowing that this meant hunger for the local populations. Rosenberg was, of all the defendants, the most prolific in written words. Decades of articles, books, speeches, directives, the man who had filled thousands of pages with his ideology. The editor of the Völkischer Beobachter, the party newspaper, the orator, the writer, the racist theoretician of the Third Reich. In the last moment of his life, he chose silence. Rosenberg entered the gym with a dull complexion and sunken cheeks. He walked steadily toward the scaffold. When asked if he had anything to say, he replied with a single word in a very low voice: "No." Although he had declared his atheism on multiple occasions and had built his entire philosophy on the rejection of Christianity, which he saw as a Semitic contamination of the Nordic spirit, a Protestant chaplain accompanied him to the steps of the gallows. Rosenberg looked at him once, expressionless. Then he looked straight ahead. The rope had to be tightened twice. 90 seconds after the trapdoor fell, it was hanging from the rope. Hans Frank was the only one of the 10 convicts who entered the gymnasium with a smile on his face. It was a strange, almost serene smile. Frank was born on May 23, 1900, in Karlsruhe, the son of a lawyer who was later disbarred for fraudulent conduct. He studied law in Munich and Kiel, and by 1930 he was the head of the NSDAP's legal department. In March 1933, he was appointed Minister of Justice of Bavaria. In 1934, he moved to the federal level as Reich Minister without portfolio. In 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, Frank was appointed Governor-General of the occupied Polish territories. On October 3, 1939, before taking formal office, he had already described his policy with a sentence that was read in the courtroom and that went through press agencies around the world. "Poland will be treated as a colony. The Poles will become the slaves of the great German world empire." The general government area contained between 2.5 and 3.5 million Jews at the beginning of the occupation. Frank participated in their extermination from the first months. On December 16, 1941, he told his cabinet, "We must annihilate the Jews, wherever we find them and wherever possible, in order to maintain the structure of the Reich as a whole." By January 25, 1944, he estimated that there were only 100,000 Jews left in his territory. He had recorded them accurately in his personal diary, which was presented as evidence at the trial. Frank's diary, more than 38 volumes written with bureaucratic meticulousness, was one of the most devastating documentary sources of the entire process. Frank had written down his crimes as if they were minutes of board meetings. His IQ was 130. He was a university student. He had had a complete legal training. During the trial, Frank experienced something unusual among his co-defendants, genuine religious conversion, at least in appearance. He reconverted to Roman Catholicism after his arrest. In his first statement to the court in August 1946, he said that he felt terrible guilt for what happened in the territories under his command. It was the most explicit acknowledgement of moral responsibility the trial had heard from the bench. His lawyers disapproved. His co-defendants ignored him. The court took it into account, but not as a sufficient mitigating circumstance to modify the sentence. That smile as he entered the gym was, in Smith's interpretation, that of a man who had found relief in the idea of atoning for his crimes. It was neither triumph nor challenge. It was something closer to relief. On the scaffold, Frank spoke quietly, almost in a whisper. "I am grateful for the good treatment I received during my captivity, and I ask God to welcome me with mercy." He closed his eyes when they put the black hood on him. Wilhelm Frick was the sixth to die that night at 2:05 a.m., 6 minutes after Rosenberg was pronounced dead. He was born on March 12, 1877 in Alsens, in the Rhenish Palatinate. He was the oldest of all those sentenced to death that night, 69 years old. He studied law in Munich, Berlin, Heidelberg and Göttingen. He joined the Munich police force in 1904, and it was there that he crossed paths with Hitler. During the Beer Hall Putsch of November 1923, Frick, who was then in charge of the Munich Police Department, provided inside information to the putschists and was tried for it, although he received a suspended sentence. His early loyalty to the party earned him election to the Reichstag in 1924 as part of the Nazi delegation. Frick was not a general or an ideologue in Rosenberg's sense. He was a bureaucrat, an expert in administrative law who had entered the dock with the reputation of having been the main legislative architect of the Nazi dictatorship. As Reichsminister of the Interior from 1933 to 1943, it was Frick who drafted, signed and administered the laws that suppressed opposition parties, dissolved trade unions, installed the legal basis of the Gestapo and built the legal scaffolding of the totalitarian state. The Nuremberg laws of 1935, which stripped Jews of German citizenship and prohibited marriages between Jews and non-Jews, bore his signature and technical elaboration. His IQ was 124, in the superior range. In 1943, when the mass extermination of Jews in the East was in full swing and already an open secret among the Reich's top officials, Frick signed a decree placing Jews outside the law and formally handing them over to the Gestapo. The court found that it had full knowledge of the euthanasia programs practiced in hospitals and asylums under its ministerial jurisdiction, where approximately 275,000 mentally ill, disabled, and people considered useless mouths by the regime were murdered. Complaints about those deaths formally reached his office. He took no action to stop them. Frick entered the execution chamber at 2:05 a.m. He walked to the gallows with a steady step. His only words were four: "Long live eternal Germany." Falling through the trapdoor like Keitel before him, Frick hit his head against the edges of the mechanism. The wounds were documented in the post-mortem photographs. Julius Streicher was the most disturbing of all the condemned that night. He was born on February 12, 1885 in Fleinhausen, a small town in Bavaria. He was the son of a schoolteacher. He himself worked as a teacher before joining the German army in World War I. After the war, he became one of Hitler's first followers and took part in the Beer Hall Putsch of November 1923. From 1925 to 1940, he was the Gauleiter of Franconia. But his most defining position was as editor of the weekly Der Stürmer, which he published without interruption between 1923 and the last issue in March 1945. In 1935, the Stürmer reached a circulation of 600,000 copies per issue. Each issue was dedicated, in one way or another, to the most violent and degrading anti-Semitic propaganda ever circulated in a mass media. The articles combined medieval accusations of ritual crimes with obscene caricatures and articles that directly called for extermination. His IQ was 106, the lowest in the group. The co-defendants themselves despised him. Göring told Gilbert that Streicher was a moron who had damaged the party with his excesses more than he had served it. Several defendants asked not to share transportation with him. The court found that between 1938 and 1944, Streicher had published dozens of articles in his newspaper explicitly calling for the extermination of European Jewry, and that he had done so while learning of the actual progress of that extermination through the press he read. The journalist from his own newspaper had traveled to the ghettos of the East in the spring of 1943. The Jewish weekly Israelitisches Wochenblatt, which Streicher received and read, reported in each issue the figures of deportees and murdered. In issues for the summer and autumn of 1942, 72,729 deaths were cited in Warsaw, 17,542 in Lodz, 125,000 in Romania, 700,000 in Poland. Streicher never had the power to make operational decisions about extermination, but the court determined that his words had been direct fuel for those who did take them, and that he knew it. On the night of the execution, the journalists who inspected the cells saw him restless, without the calm of some of his companions. Streicher entered the gym, giving the feeling of being on the edge. He walked to the number 1 gallows with his eyes shot. At the bottom of the stairs, when the guard stopped him for formal identification, he let out a cry that, according to correspondent Smith, sent a shiver down my spine. "Heil Hitler!" As he climbed the steps, he shouted, "Now I am going to God," and Purim Fest, 1946. Purim is the Jewish holiday that commemorates the salvation of the Hebrew people from an attempt at extermination in ancient Persia. Streicher, the most visible anti-Semite in all of Germany, chose as his last public phrase a reference to that celebration. The meaning was transparent and disgusting. He saw himself as a victim. According to the Time reporter present that night, Streicher tried to kick Woods and his assistants as they tightened the rope. It was necessary for the guards to hold him tightly. He added, "The Bolsheviks will one day hang you." His last documented words, before the hood silenced him, were directed at his absent wife. "Adele, dear wife." The trap door opened. Fritz Sauckel did not want to put on his coat before leaving his cell. It was a gesture that several witnesses noticed that night. The guards had to take him anyway. Sauckel was 51 years old at the time of his execution. He was born on October 27, 1894 in Haßfurt, Bavaria. He had gone to sea as a merchant seaman at the age of 15, sailing for years on ships that toured northern Europe. World War I found him at sea. He was interned in France as a prisoner of war in 1914 and was not released until 1919. He returned to Germany with the country in ruins. He earned his living as an industrial worker. He joined the NSDAP in 1923 and became Gauleiter of Thuringia in 1927, a position from which he built an efficient regional political organization. He was loyal, methodical, and disciplined. He was not an intellectual. His IQ of 118 was the 4th lowest in the group, but he was a competent organizer. On March 21, 1942, Hitler appointed him General Plenipotentiary for the utilization of manpower, with authority over all available labor in the occupied territories. It was the bureaucratic version of what historians would describe as the largest labor slavery program in modern history. Under that charge, Sauckel organized the deportation for slave labor of more than 5 million people from the occupied countries. In a statement on March 1, 1944, Sauckel admitted to his own subordinates that, Of the 5 million foreign workers who came to Germany, not even 200,000 came voluntarily. The recruitment process, which he described in another document as resembling the old Shanghai system, involved police raids, violence, and the separation of families. Historian Joseph Persico described Sokol as the least imposing figure among the accused, a little man with a gleaming head, sad brown eyes, and a moustache copied from Hitler's. On the bench, Sokol was constantly confused. His defense consisted of denying personal responsibility for the workers' conditions, attributing each phase of the program to another agency. When they showed him documents with his signature giving specific orders, he said that others had prepared them and that he had not always read what he signed. And yet, on the gallows, the last composure he managed to sustain was that of a victim. When asked if he had anything to say, Sokol protested with the same conviction he had shown throughout the trial. "I die innocently. The verdict was unfair. God protect Germany and make Germany great again. Long live Germany, and God protect my family." He was the man who had sent millions of people to die in armaments factories, claiming his own innocence in the last seconds of his life. Alfred Jodl entered the execution chamber at 2:34 a.m. with the collar of his Wehrmacht uniform coat half lifted from behind his back, as if he had put it on quickly. His features were tense. She wet her lips continuously as she walked. He was born on May 10, 1890 in Würzburg, Bavaria. He was the son of an artillery captain in the Bavarian army. He pursued his military career with a quiet determination. He studied at the War Academy. In 1935, he became chief of the National Defense Section in the OKW, and in August 1939, just days before the outbreak of war, he returned to the OKW to become chief of the Operational General Staff, the position he would hold until the end of the war. His IQ was 127 on Gilbert's tests. He was the General of Artillery and Chief of the Operational Staff of the OKW. In the words of the tribunal, he was the true planner of war, largely responsible for the strategy and conduct of military operations. His personal diary, seized by the Allies, documented his involvement in planning the invasions of Austria, Czechoslovakia, Norway, the Netherlands, Yugoslavia, Greece, and the Soviet Union. In a diary entry after the Sudeten crisis in 1938, he had written with admiration that the Führer's genius had once again achieved victory without resorting to force. The note was read aloud in the courtroom. Jodl had signed on October 18, 1942, the commando order ordering the execution of all Allied soldiers captured in commando operations, even if they were in uniform and had surrendered. In October 1944, he had ordered the forced evacuation of the entire population of northern Norway and the destruction of their homes. Some 30,000 houses were damaged, according to the Norwegian government, so that they could not collaborate with the Soviet advance. His defense was the same as Keitel's, a soldier, orders from above. The court rejected it with the same words. But there is one piece of information that makes Jodl's case more complex than others. In 1953, 7 years after his execution, a German denazification court in Munich acquitted him posthumously, finding that he had acted as a legitimate military officer and not a criminal. The sentence was much discussed. Historians have since debated whether Jodl's position was that of a war criminal or that of a military man who executed policies he should have been able to reject. The debate is not closed. Despite the nervousness visible that night, Jodl spoke in a firm, dry voice on the gallows, like an officer addressing his troops. "My greetings to you, my Germany." The trapdoor opened at 2:34. His death was prolonged. The last of the 10 men to die was Arthur C. Sinquat. He entered the gym at 2:38 a.m. on October 16th, in the exact words of reporter Kingsbury Smith. He was wearing glasses, which gave him a cartoonish, easily recognizable appearance. He limped as he walked, dragging his right leg slightly. It was the trace of a wound from the First World War that had not fully healed. Seyss-Inquart was born on July 22, 1892, in Stanin, now Stonažov in the Czech Republic, a town in northwestern Bohemia that was then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He was a lawyer by profession. He had been associated with the Austrian Nazi movement since 1931, although he had no formal party membership until March 13, 1938, the Anschluss Day itself. He had been appointed state councillor in Austria in May 1937 under direct German pressure, and on the 11th of March 1938, during the decisive hours of the annexation, he was installed as Chancellor of Austria, while Göring dictated by telephone from Berlin the texts of the telegrams that Seyss-Inquart was supposed to send to give the appearance of legality to an invasion already underway. Seyss-Inquart never sent that telegram. The lie circulated anyway. The German press reported that he had called for military intervention. His IQ was 141, the second highest in the group after Schacht. He was, in terms of measured intelligence, the brightest of the 10 who died that night, and he was also one of only 2, along with Frank, to openly acknowledge his guilt. As Reich Commissar for the occupied Netherlands since May 18, 1940, Seyss-Inquart oversaw the deportation of approximately 120,000 of the 140,000 Dutch Jews to Auschwitz and the other death camps. He knew where they were going. He testified during the trial that he had heard that Jews lived relatively well at Auschwitz. Given his position and the access to information he had, the court found that claim impossible to believe. Under his command, more than 500,000 Dutch were deported as forced laborers to Germany. He used Dutch police for mass arrests, threatening reprisals against the families of police officers who refused to participate. Dutch courts were pressured to hand down harsh sentences, and when they were reluctant to impose prison sentences because detainees often died anyway, Seyss-Inquart expanded the use of summary police courts. In recent weeks, he had asked for passages from the Bible to be read to him. When the journalists asked his guardians how he behaved, the answer was that he was calm and reflective. His last words on the scaffold closed the night with a phrase that, according to several observers, had an almost testamentary quality. "I hope that this execution will be the last act of the tragedy of the Second World War, and that a lesson will be learned so that peace and understanding will be achieved among nations. I believe in Germany." The trapdoor fell at 2:46. Arthur Seyss-Inquart was pronounced dead at 2:57 a.m. on October 16, 1946. The process had lasted less than 2 hours. Rudolf Hess was sentenced to life imprisonment. He was born on April 26, 1894 in Alexandria, where his German father was a merchant. The third member of the NSDAP by card number, he participated in the 1923 Beer Hall Putsch and was imprisoned in Landsberg alongside Hitler, to whom he served as secretary during the drafting of Mein Kampf. On May 10, 1941, he flew a modified Messerschmitt Bf 110 Solo from Augsburg to Scotland on a peacekeeping mission not authorized by Hitler, who declared him mentally disturbed. During the trial, he feigned amnesiac for months. His comment to the indictment brief was simply, "I don't remember," before admitting it was a sham. The court found him guilty only on counts 1 and 2, with an IQ of 120. The Soviet member wanted the death penalty. Hess was sent to Spandau in July 1947, a prison designed for 600 people, emptied exclusively for the 7 Nuremberg convicts. Since 1966, when the others were being liberated, it remained as its only inhabitant. Guards from the 4 Allied powers rotated monthly to guard a single elderly man with severe arthritis and heart problems, while the Soviet Union systematically vetoed any proposal for release. On August 17, 1987, he was found dead in the prison garden at the age of 93. The official verdict was suicide with the electric cord of a lamp, although his physical mobility was so reduced that the hypothesis was never definitively resolved. Spandau prison was demolished the following week, day and night, to prevent it from becoming a neo-Nazi pilgrimage site. The site is now a car park. Walter Funk was sentenced to life in prison. He was born on August 18, 1890, in Trakehnen, East Prussia, and before joining the NSDAP in 1931, he was editor-in-chief of the Berliner Börsenzeitung. As president of the Reichsbank since 1939, he reached an agreement with the SS in 1942 to receive the personal belongings confiscated from the victims of the camps: coins, jewelry, watches, and the gold extracted from dental fillings and teeth pulled out of corpses stored in the basements of the bank. When his subordinates asked about the shipments, Funk told them to "don't ask too many questions." The testimony about those vaults, accompanied by photographs taken by the US military when they were discovered, produced absolute silence in room 600. He was released in 1957 due to deteriorating health. He died in Düsseldorf on 31 May 1960. Erich Raeder, Grand Admiral and Commander of the Kriegsmarine until 1943, also received life imprisonment. The court found that, together with Rosenberg, he had originated the plan to attack Norway. Released in 1955 for health reasons, he died in Kiel on November 6, 1960. Karl Dönitz was the only Nuremberg convict to become German head of state, a position he held between April 30th and May 23, 1945, when he signed the unconditional surrender. His IQ of 138 matched Göring's. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison, not for unrestricted submarine warfare, as Admiral Chester Nimitz filed a statement in court admitting that the US Navy had done exactly the same thing in the Pacific from day one, but for other aspects of his conduct. He served the full 10 years in Spandau and was released on October 1, 1956. He published his memoirs 10 Jahre und 20 Tage in 1958. He died on December 24, 1980 in Aumühle at the age of 89, being the last survivor of the Nuremberg bench. Baldur von Schirach was sentenced to 20 years. He was born on May 9, 1907 in Berlin, of partially American origin. His maternal great-grandfather was a Union officer in the American Civil War. He joined the NSDAP at the age of 18 and from 1933 controlled the Hitlerjugend until by 1940 97% of eligible young Germans were members. As Gauleiter of Vienna since 1940, he presided over the deportation of the city's remaining 60,000 Jews, championing it in September 1942 as a contribution to European culture. In his closing statements to the court in August 1946, he made an explicit criticism of Hitler, saying that he had educated him for a man who murdered for millions. The court noted it without changing the sentence. He turned 20 years old and was released on September 30, 1966. He died on August 8, 1974. Albert Speer, Hitler's favorite architect, was also sentenced to 20 years for his participation in the slave labor program as Minister of Armaments from February 1942. Their demands for labor from Sokol had been the driving force behind the deportations of millions of forced laborers from the occupied territories. By 1943, armament production under his direction was 4 times higher than in 1941. The court acknowledged that it had set up blockaded industries that allowed some workers to remain in their countries, and that in the final months of the war, it had sabotaged Hitler's scorched earth order at personal risk. He also completed his full 20 years, released on the same day as von Schirach. His memoirs, Inside the Third Reich, 1969, built the image of the good Nazi that later research by historians such as Adam Tooze dismantled. Speer had attended the Posen Conference in 1943, where Himmler explicitly spoke of extermination before the Reich elite. He died on September 1, 1981 in London. Konstantin von Neurath, the oldest in the dock at the age of 73 at the time of the verdict, was sentenced to 15 years in prison. a career diplomat born on February 2, 1873, in Klein-Gladbach, Württemberg. He had served as ambassador to Italy and Britain before becoming foreign minister from 1932, a position he held under Hitler until he was replaced by Ribbentrop on February 4, 1938. Its function was to give the regime a semblance of continuity with traditional diplomatic Germany. On March 18, 1939, he was appointed Reich Protector for Bohemia and Moravia, where under his authority 8,000 prominent Czechs were arrested on September 1, 1939, 9 student leaders shot without trial in November of that year, and 1,200 students imprisoned after the closure of all the universities in the Protectorate. When Hitler summoned him on September 27, 1941, to tell him that Heydrich would be sent to the Protectorate because he considered him insufficiently harsh, von Neurath tried unsuccessfully to dissuade him. He then asked for his resignation, and it was nominally granted, retiring to his estate while Heydrich ruled de facto. The court found extenuating circumstances. It had interceded for the release of several arrested in September 1939, but he also found that he had accepted the position knowing what Nazi occupation policies meant in practice, and that under his signature had been issued proclamations announcing executions. He was released on November 6, 1954, having served 8 of 15 years, due to severe deterioration of health. He died on August 14, 1956, in Leinfelden. On October 1, 1946, Lord Lawrence read 3 acquittals which the Soviet member of the tribunal, Major General Iona Nikitchenko, immediately challenged by a formal dissenting opinion annexed to the ruling. Hjalmar Schacht, the smartest on the bench with 143 IQ points, had financed the rearmament through the MEFO funds, 5-year promissory notes that allowed the Reich to spend approximately 12 billion Reichsmarks on armaments between 1933 and 1938 without appearing in the budget. The court recognized all this, but found that the inference that Schacht knew that such rearmament was part of a plan for wars of aggression was not proven beyond reasonable doubt, in part because he was arrested by the Gestapo in July 1944 and spent the rest of the war in concentration camps. Franz von Papen, coefficient of 134, was the political hinge that made possible Hitler's appointment as Chancellor on January 30, 1933, believing he could control it. The court acknowledged that it had systematically undermined Schuschnigg's Austrian government and organized the path to the Anschluss, but determined that such offenses against political morality were not criminal under the court's charter. Hans Fritzsche, the radio commentator whose weekly program Hans Fritzsche Speaks was one of the most listened to in Germany during the war, was acquitted because the court found that he was executing directives formulated by Goebbels and press officer Dietrich, not formulating them. Their broadcasts contained overt anti-Semitism, but could not be proven to directly incite atrocities. Moreover, on 2 occasions, he had tried unsuccessfully to have Streicher's Stürmer suppressed. The 3 acquitted were later tried by German denazification courts. Schacht served a tiny fraction of his sentence and died at the age of 93 in 1970, having founded his own bank. Von Papen was less than 3 years old and died in Stuttgart in 1969 at the age of 89, the last Chancellor of the Weimar Republic. Fritzsche was less than 3 years old and died in Cologne on September 27, 1953. Martin Bormann was born on June 17, 1900 in Halberstadt, the son of a postal employee. He gradually rose through the party bureaucracy until he became, after Hesse's flight in 1941, chief of the party chancellery, and then, from 12 April 1943, Hitler's personal secretary. That position meant that he controlled physical access to the Führer. No one reached Hitler without passing through Bormann, and no order went out without his knowledge. His influence was enormous precisely because of his public invisibility, managing memos and information flows while Göring accumulated medals. The court tried him in absentia on October 1, 1946, and sentenced him to death, without having any verifiable information about his whereabouts since the night of May 1st to 2nd, 1945, when he attempted to escape from the bunker of the Reich Chancellery in Berlin. For decades, rumors circulated that he had escaped to Argentina with the help of the Odessa network, and Simon Wiesenthal kept him on his wanted fugitive list for years. The truth was simpler. In 1972, construction sites on Berlin's Lehrter Strasse, a few meters from the former Chancellery, unearthed skeletal remains that forensic analysis and dental comparison identified as those of Bormann. He had probably died on May 2, 1945, in the chaos of the escape by a shot or the explosion of a Panzerfaust during street fighting. In 1998, a mitochondrial DNA analysis compared to that of his closest living relative definitively confirmed the identification. The man who had controlled access to power in the Reich died that night on a Berlin street in flames, without trial, without scaffold, and without witnesses. At 3 a.m. on October 16, 1946, the last of the 10 men was pronounced dead. The gymnasium was opened to journalists. The bodies lay on simple wooden boxes, with name tags pinned to their clothes and the executioner's noose still knotted around their necks. Göring's body was placed next to them to occupy its rightful space in the queue and to comply with the formal examination procedure before the representatives of the 4 branches of government and the 2 German civilian witnesses, the Bavarian Minister-President Wilhelm Högner and the Bavarian Supreme Court prosecutor Jacob Meissner. Assistant U.S. Attorney Whitney Harris, present on Jackson's behalf, summed each up in one sentence. Keitel spoke like a Prussian soldier, Kaltenbrunner with an apologetic tone, Frank very softly, Jodl like an officer addressing his troops. 2 military trucks transported the 11 coffins to Munich in the early hours of the morning. During the whole day they were cremated in the cemetery of Ostfriedhof. At sunset, the 11 urns were taken to the Convents, a small tributary of the Isar, and the ashes poured into the water. The Isar carried them to the Danube to the Black Sea. The procedure was deliberate in every detail. No tomb, no geographical point that could become a place of worship. That same night, as reported by Time magazine on October 28, 1946, a group of German children hung an effigy of Göring near the imperial castle in Nuremberg and burned it in silence, while the flames cast shadows on the ruins of the city that had given its name to the laws of hatred. John Clarence Woods was a master sergeant in the U.S. Army born in Wichita, Kansas in 1911. He had served as the Army's executioner since 1943 and claimed to have executed 347 people, a figure that is impossible to verify. Nuremberg executions were to employ the long fall method, designed to produce immediate cervical fracture. It required calculating the length of the rope according to the weight and constitution of each convict. Woods used standard lengths that did not compensate for those differences, and the result, documented in medical reports that remained classified for years, was that several of the 10 died not from broken necks, but from slow strangulation. It took Ribbentrop 13 minutes to be pronounced dead after the fall. Other unpublished records pointed to longer times. The trapdoors, moreover, were too narrow, and at least Keitel and Frick hit their heads against the edges as they descended, injuries documented in post-mortem photographs. In a 1950 interview, Wood stated without apparent irony, "They all died brave men." He died on July 21st of that same year in the Marshall Islands, accidentally electrocuted while repairing an electrical system. He was 38 years old. The man who had operated the lever at Nuremberg outlived the men he killed by less than 4 years. The Nuremberg trial did not resolve all the questions it raised. The defendants themselves vehemently discussed for 11 months whether a tribunal formed by the victors could impart justice to the vanquished, whether it was legitimate to apply retroactively criminal offences that did not exist in positive international law when the acts were committed, whether the responsibility to obey orders had any limits. Those questions did not disappear with the executions of October 16th. What the Nuremberg Tribunal did establish was something unprecedented in legal history: that individuals who planned and carried out wars of aggression and crimes against humanity were criminally responsible for those acts under international law, regardless of their rank, their position, or the instructions they received. United Nations General Assembly Resolution 95, adopted on December 11, 1946, formally reaffirmed the Nuremberg Principles as part of customary international law. The trial also forever fixed in the public record how the Third Reich had functioned in its internal mechanisms. The documents seized, the minutes of the meetings, the directives signed, the testimonies under oath, everything was in the file. There was no way to say that it was not known, because the trial established what was known and who knew it, with names and dates and signatures. Every international criminal tribunal that came after has its direct foundation in what those judges decided in that room of the Palace of Justice in Nuremberg. The International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, established in 1993, the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, 1994, the Permanent International Criminal Court established by the Rome Statute in 1998, which entered into force on July 1, 2002. The gymnasium where the 10 men died no longer exists. It was demolished to prevent it from becoming an involuntary memorial. Courtroom 600, where the trial took place, is still standing and is still used as a courtroom for the Nuremberg Regional Court. The chair in which Göring sat is still the defendant's chair. The same microphones hang from the ceiling. The room was restored and transformed into a partially museum space in 2010 with an attached documentation museum, the Memoriam Nuremberg Trials, which receives tens of thousands of visitors from all over the world every year. The building that was the theatre of the end of the Third Reich continues to judge. Cases are ordinary now: divorces, contract disputes, misdemeanors. The weight of what happened within those walls has not disappeared. It has only changed shape.